G'day everybody, my name is Elliot Waters and you're listening to the Dysregulated podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, feel free to like, subscribe, give us a great rating and share it around with your mates. And you can follow me on Instagram at elliot.t.waters. So today's episode is on identity disturbance, one of the key components of borderline personality disorder. Now, in this episode, I don't want to go into too much of the theory, too much of the science. I want this episode to be about my real life experiences dealing with identity disturbance. And to highlight this fact, there is one part of my persona that I really want to hone in on, and that is what I call my rock and roll star. So to understand how the rock and roll star came to being, we have to go back to when I was around 16 years of age. Year 10 at high school, when everyone started going to parties, started drinking, having a good time, chicks all of a sudden didn't have cooties anymore. It was this whole new world. And I must say, I was a little bit late to the party, so to speak. And unfortunately, that has had some wide-ranging consequences. And yet here I am, as a 32-year-old, still today do I have these, as I call them, high school issues. And it's out of these high school issues that the rock and roll star was born. Now, I haven't gone too much into these sorts of formative years so far on the podcast, but I will be, I think, a little bit more from now on because it is so important to how I present myself today. It is hugely important to understand what my teenage years were like because that is where a lot of these bad behaviours, bad cognitions, etc. seem to stem from. So it's very important that we go through it. So the rock and roll star. The rock and roll star is essentially the version of me, my identity, the identity in which I drink too much, take illicit substances if I do dabble in that, stay up late, just live that rock and roll lifestyle, try and get with chicks and failing miserably, all that sort of really impulsive sort of behaviours tend to stem from this rock and roll star. My mother calls this part of my psyche, if you will, my persona, the loose cannon. And that is a very astute observation because that is exactly what the rock and roll star is like, a very loose cannon indeed. So I remember people would go to parties and stuff and I wouldn't go at first because I don't know. I was smothered with my family's love, which is not a bad thing. But at the same time, it did sort of put the brakes on that sort of development that was so important. And you can imagine, if you're going to parties and stuff, that's cool. If you're not going to parties, that's uncool. At a very basic level, this is what it's all about. So I used to get ripped on a little bit for not going to these parties. And then all of a sudden I started going to the parties, but I was taking strawberry milk because I was an athlete. Another of my personas, the athletic version of me, used to take strawberry milk to parties because my body was a temple and I wish it still was. So there was no way in hell I was going to be drinking alcohol. It was all about the strawberry milk. The only problem is people used to nick me strawberry milk and put vodka in it. But anyway, and then I would pretend that I couldn't taste it in there and be like, oh, what? I don't know what's going on, and just drink it anyway. So yes, the rock and roll star persona, that's where it was born because it was in response to people ripping us off. And I had this belief, this theory, and again, like this rock and roll star's still around, so this still holds true. I had this belief and theory that if we went harder than everybody else, so if we drank more, if we stayed up later, if we built up all these uber cool stories and all these experiences that centered on just being loose and wild, we wouldn't get ripped off anymore. And that is where it all stems from. This idea that people are ripping us off, whether it's behind our back or to our face, doesn't matter. And in order to ensure that that doesn't happen, we need to live life on the edge more than anyone else. And we need to go harder than anyone else because that will prove to people that we are cool. Because at the end of the day, that's what it was all about, trying to be cool and to fit in. Now, that's all well and good, everyone when they're younger sort of goes through this phase and all this sort of stuff. And a lot of what I'm talking about at the moment when it was all born out of these experiences was, like I said, when I was around 16, year 10 at school, and then onwards, through the school years and then outside as well. But the thing is, I'm 32 years old now, 32. So, do the maths, that's double of 16. And yet we still feel this way. You know, I'm reeling off a weekend I just had where the rock and roll star was out. Like, I was telling people that the rock and roll star was out. This is no joke. You know, this isn't just some, trying to hold on to my childhood sort of thing. This is a very distinct part of my persona, part of my identity. And this is something people with BPD fall into the trap of a lot, is to try and blend in with other people and blend in with groups so we don't stick out and get ripped off. So the way we do that is to take on the good and the bad qualities and then try and mimic what other people are doing. So think your identity, right, is like your anchor point. So, you might change jobs, you might have new interests, and all that sort of stuff. But the identity, your core fundamental identity should theoretically just about stay the same. But for those with BPD, we just swish around, move around to the whims of other people. It's part of having no boundaries. There's no strong, solid sense of self or view of self that I suppose is resistant to changes in our environments, whether it is, for example, jobs or, new interests that other friends have or that maybe, we latch onto, all this different thing, social pressures, etc. Our identity should stay reasonably anchored. Obviously, the things around it can change. You can pick up new hobbies and stuff, but your identity stays just about the same. And for those with BPD, we are not anchored to the moment at all. That's why mindfulness is so important, but our identity isn't anchored either. And then we change at the different changes of the winds, our personality, our personas tend to go with it. And it's all a protective, defensive mechanism. And that's certainly where this particular identity of mine, the rock and roll star, has come out of. It was all about protecting us from getting ripped off. And when I give presentations to schools and stuff for the Black Dog Institute, I always talk about my high school issues. And I try to sort of talk about them in a way that I don't really have them anymore, but that's just not true. It's just not true. The high school issues are there. And this is just one component of what I would call my high school issues. There is plenty more to come, don't you worry. But as you'll find out in future episodes and from this episode as well, the age of 16 was and is still so pivotal for my presentation here today as a 32-year-old. So the rock and roll star, it's all about drinking more, it's all about doing more illicit substances, it's all about staying up later and creating these unbelievable, hilarious stories so people will sit back and go, man, Elliot, you're so cool, you're the coolest dude in the world, I wish I was just like you. That is literally what we're aiming for. And, over the years, I've sort of been, maybe people don't say, there's not that many people that wish they lived like me. But there are people, that have said that some of my stories, some of the things I've done are pretty cool. And I've felt so accepted and like I belong when those sorts of comments, that feedback occurs. It's a great feeling. But again, it's coming out of this immature, I don't mean immature as in like silly and stupid. I mean, literally before maturity, before our psyche matured, these issues, this is where it all stems from. And I think a lot of people sort of go through this. And I don't think this part, the whole, this wild side, this isn't just an Elliot thing. But where it is different is, again, people sort of go through their early 20s and then they sort of cut it off and they turn into adults is the idea, and then move on and think preferences change, goals change, and people sort of mature. The thing is, I'm 32, like I've said, and this sort of stuff still plagues me as recent as the weekend just gone. It's really frustrating. And like I said, it's a big part of BPD. I'm not going to go through the theory and stuff now. I will do that in future episodes, but he's a huge part of BPD, and it's no real surprise that I have succumbed to this little issue. But I need to pull it in and put the reins on it because, well, the first thing is no one actually cares that much. No one cares. If they did used to care, they don't care anymore about having the wildest stories that there are, people's, again, perspectives and stuff sort of change. And really, if anything, it's counterproductive that we're still trying to, get these amazing rock and roll stories, living the rock and roll star dream. The fact that we're still trying to do it, I think, if anything, is looked upon with more of a negative light because it's like, come on, man, you need to grow up, come on, what are you doing? And it's a very, very good point, that one that I struggle to sort of, not comprehend, but accept, I suppose. But we need to accept it. It ain't cool anymore. It's a bit lame, to be honest, And so the sooner that we can sort of resolve this little identity problem, the better. And I've got a few, like I've got like the academic Elliot, I've got the rock and roll star Elliot, I've got the like athletic outdoorsy Elliot. There's a few sort of different things going on. And if you look at them all, they're basically attempts to be accepted by the group that I'm in. So because people with BPD have used, as a general rule, poor boundaries, we tend to latch on to what other people are doing, the positive stuff or the stuff that's viewed positively, latch onto these attributes of the group that we're in and sort of, like a chameleon, I suppose, try and blend in as well as we can. And it's a defensive mechanism, like I said, so we don't get ripped off. And that's exactly, I've done my fair share of illicit substances. Don't get me wrong, not unbelievable amounts, but if you've listened to the podcast, you know that, generally speaking, I have a little bit of an issue with putting the brakes on some of the substance use stuff going on. Like even caffeine being a great example. Caffeine use disorder. Go back and listen to that episode. It is a beauty. But the motivation for doing these things isn't to have a good time, and it never has been. It's never been about having a good time, and most of the time when I do go to excess, I'm not having a good time anyway. The reasons why we do it is so no one can rip me off and say, Elliot, you're a little mummy's boy and you just need to go out and live a bit. You haven't experienced what we've experienced. That is literally my goals, even as recent as the weekend just gone, as to why I'm doing these things to excess. It is so we just don't get ripped off anymore. Okay, well, we're starting to get to the real nitty-gritty. This is very, very exciting. And it is exciting because so much of my presentation today stems from things in the past. And I'm not talking a year ago, 2, 3 years ago. I'm talking 15 years ago. We need to go back to there to really understand what on earth is going on here today. And this is something I've got to do in therapy as well. And I haven't probably... in therapy, I haven't really nailed into, this sort of area of my past because it's a bit too raw and it's still quite raw. And there's a lot of negative emotion is carried along with these experiences from the past. But at the same time, if we're going to let go of the past and move forward and develop our identity where, it is anchored to a middle spot and we know who we are, we know what we stand for, etc., I've really got to peel back the layers here and get to this nitty-gritty stuff, whether it's on the podcast, because this is, nice and cathartic, or especially, more importantly, in therapy. So that is one of the little goals moving forward, is to go back to the past, see what was going on, see what was actually true and what wasn't, and then let it go. Let it go, Elliot, for God's sakes. Come on. Anyway, there's a little bit of further insight into my world. My identity disturbance. Like I said, I'm going to do an episode down the track where I'm going to look at it a little bit more scientifically, but I wanted today's episode to be a nice little, just highlight sort of how what might seem little back in your formative years can turn into something huge. And that's the thing, I don't have control over this at all. I head into these sorts of high-risk situations knowing full well that these are the conditions for which my rock and roll star's going to come out. We need to keep a lid on this, keep things in a control. And unfortunately, more often than not, if I have this feeling that the rock and roll star is brewing inside, it's already too late by that point. It is too late. And you know what? It's really not that cool that this keeps happening at 32 years old. It's a bit lame, to be honest. But hey, I'm only human, and this is part of my experiences. And that's the thing. There'll be people listening to this podcast right now who, dare I say it, would have been one of these people who would have been ripping me off back in the past. But the thing is, I have a funny suspicion that the majority wouldn't even realise that they were one of the people I'm talking about. And that's because although their words, I suppose, really cut deep, the words weren't that bad and there wasn't that many. Like I didn't get ripped off constantly. I was pretty popular through high school, thankfully. Not because I was cool or anything. It was because, I guess I was nice and people, like nice people and I tried to be a good person. But it certainly wasn't because I was cool and I couldn't handle that. I wanted to be cool. but I just wasn't. And I needed to sort of accept that and accept the fact that maybe I'm not cool, but I'm a decent person. That's pretty good. That's pretty cool in itself. But, there'll be people listening to this episode, and I'm telling you, I'm not going to be pointing fingers, but some of you people were a part of this story, but your actions were actually so minute and minimal and not with venom behind it that you wouldn't probably even think that you were part of this story. And it goes to show how people who are susceptible to this way of thinking, because that's the thing, nature versus nurture, environment versus genetics. I would say overall with my mental health story, there's a really strong genetic component, which has made me more susceptible to these sorts of words cutting really deep than someone without that genetic predisposition. So yes, it took certain things in my environment to bring out some of this negative emotion, this poor way of thinking, these bad negative cognitions. But I think I was genetically predisposed to this way of thinking already. And it only took a little nudge from people, some little offhand comments that people probably don't even remember saying, just a little nudge to get the ball rolling. And unfortunately, because I didn't pull the ball up or divert it, or I've just let it keep going, here we are at 32. It's now a boulder, and we're still plagued by this idea that we need to be cool and we need to be accepted. And unfortunately, the way in which I've identified, whether rightly or wrongly, to do just that is to be a rock and roll star, drink to excess, have some substances that maybe you shouldn't be having, trying to pick up chicks very poorly, I might add. But that's the sort of way of thinking. If we can build up these awesome, cool stories, no one's going to rip us off anymore. And this all started during my mid-teens, and yet here we are at 32 with the same problems. Okay, there's a bit of a deep episode for you. That's a beauty. So I hope you're enjoying the show. Thank you for listening. I do appreciate it. Feel free to reach out, anybody, if you're comfortable enough, to say that this sort of stuff happens to you too, because I'd love to know if it does. I must admit, for my own benefit in many ways, because, even I need reminding sometimes that it's not just us going through this sort of stuff. And I'm sure I'm not alone with this whole identity disturbance and trying to fit in and be cool and all that sort of stuff. But as I said, 32 years old, come on. We've got to put the pool cue back in the rack, And a big reason for that is because these hangovers are so brutal. It takes me a week mentally to get over it, 4 or 5 days physically to get over these hangovers. Like, it is terrible. Ugh. So I really need to retire the rock and roll star. But anyway, thank you for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode, and I'll see you next time here on the Dysregulated podcast.